All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us. We're doing another office hours event. Been a minute since we did one. I'm here with Robert Balicki. Am I
Yeah,
pronouncing that
Balicki.
right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Balicki.
Yeah.
Yeah, here with Robert Balicki, who is a staff engineer at Pinterest, where he helps the company adopt Relay, the framework for building React apps that are powered by GraphQL data. Previously, he worked on Relay at Meta, and he's worked on building frameworks for building apps in various forms for 13 years. And yeah, we're here to talk about lots of stuff, but he just released the version 1 of Isograph. Yeah, Robert, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sweet. All right. Um, Hi, folks. I'm super excited that y'all are here to learn about Isograph. I'm going to be talking about Isograph, but also, Carl, feel free to interrupt me if you want me to go down any particular rabbit hole. I'd rather this be an interesting conversation than me giving my monologue. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, here to talk about Isograph. So, Isograph is a framework for building React apps that are powered by GraphQL data. It has ambitions to be a framework for building apps that are powered by data, but sort of all in due time. Anyway, the tagline that Isograph uses is the UI framework for teams that move fast without breaking things. So that sort of begs the question: why is it so hard to move fast without breaking things? And it's really not, right? On our own side projects, I'm the king of the castle. I know how every little piece works together, and it sort of builds up to this one beautiful piece of art. But then you go to work, and it's design review this, post mortem that, manual review, blah blah. It's just slow and it's frustrating. And I'm going to make the claim that this is primarily an issue with communication and coordination. At some point in time, at some scale, nobody can keep an app in their head all at once. And so you make some changes locally. They look good. Maybe the unit test pass. Maybe it runs on your machine. Um, but then you push it and it breaks production. So there's also sort of a third aspect to this, which is a lack of contracts. That is to say, there's no automated tooling that's either preventing you from pushing broken code or sort of preventing your code from being broken in the first place. So teams, once they reach a certain size, maybe it's more people than can fit in a room at once, or can eat two pizzas, or more than Dunbar's number. At some point in time, like, the app starts to experience sort of instability. And that's not good because presumably you can afford this many engineers because there's a business built on this. And companies work around this by slowing things down, by sort of adding the manual reviews that I talked about, or by architecting their apps in a way that every little piece is independent. So you can imagine microservices, or you can imagine a website where every component fetches its own data. And that's pretty good. It's really easy to look at one file, or a set of files that you own, and say, like, yeah, I understand, this all works together, everything works correctly. But for a web page, like, this comes at severe costs, right? If every component fetches its own data, then you have a whole bunch of redundant network requests, fetching the data redundantly. So your backend is hit with more requests than it, otherwise would need to handle. The loading states that you show the user are super chaotic. And worse, if there's an outer component and an inner component, then you have network waterfalls, because the now outer component has to make its network request. That request has to complete before you even start the request for the child component. So you end up showing the data to the user later than you otherwise would. So that's not ideal. Okay. I mean, on the other hand, what if you just wrote one query for a given page? That's a pretty good experience. There's one loading state, everything renders pretty quickly, and it's kind of nice. Um, but it's brittle, because you're going to come back to this page a few months later, maybe a bunch of stuff has changed on it. And you're going to change a component, and now you no longer need a particular field, like the Instagram URL field. You go to the query declaration and you prepare to remove it, and you think, can I do this? And the answer is, I don't know. You have to do a bunch of research to figure out, is this field used by any other component? And more to the point, is the field used by other components in a way that's like somewhat undetectable, like via JSON.stringify or object.keys, or what if somebody lands a component at the same time that starts to use that field? So at this point in time, you have a choice. Do you try to remove the field and the upside is removing or like making your app 0.001% faster or whatever, or do you just ignore it and let the app slowly get slower but then avoid the risk of breaking production? And we're developers, we're not trying to break production on a Friday, so yeah, we're not going to remove that field. And so over time, the amount of data that your app downloads just grows and grows and grows. It uses up users' bandwidth, and there's now hundreds of fields that are not used. Okay, so I hear what you're saying.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Just
go for it.
want to
Go
hop
for it.
in for a
Yeah.
second. So we just had a whole flood of people join in, so I thought I'd reintroduce real
Oh,
quick.
excellent. Okay.
Um, Also, your stream is currently just a loading state. I'm not sure if that's if you've actually started that yet, but
Oh yeah, yeah. I've
uh,
been shown my screen. I
oh
see
yeah,
myself.
I'm just seeing a spinner.
Uh,
Maybe, but
so
yeah,
let me
while
just
you're
try
debugging,
unsharing my screen and resharing it then.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us. Here today, talking with Robert Balicki about Isograph, which he just released the 1.0 of about 2 hours ago. So yeah, Robert's been a staff engineer at Pinterest. He worked on Relay previously, and he's been building frameworks for building apps for about 13 years. So, yeah, talking about Isograph, talking about Relay, talking about GraphQL, and yeah, getting into it.
Awesome.
I'm still just seeing a loading spinner. This work?
Let me just try sharing my entire uh, window instead of sharing my a specific window.
Yeah, let's try that.
Yeah, or I meant my
Worked
entire
fine in prep.
screen. Yeah. Um,
Classic.
okay.
Okay, that's working.
You see it now?
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. So I, I'm gonna go over this intro section again, but like more quickly. Thank you for the folks that were there at the beginning. But this is this is sort of it's nice context. So I'm going to talk about Isograph. Isograph is a framework for building React apps that are powered by GraphQL. In the long term, I want it to be a framework for building apps that are powered by data, but all in due time. So it uses the tagline, the UI framework for teams that move fast without breaking things, which sort of begs the question, why is it so hard to move fast without breaking things? And I'm going to claim that it's, at some scale, fundamentally a problem of communication and coordination and a lack of contracts. So in particular, nobody can keep the app in their head at once, how it all works and how it all fits together. And so somebody might push code that looks fine locally, maybe the unit tests pass, but like still ends up breaking production. So because there's a business running on these engineers' code, like that's bad. So businesses will sort of respond to this in two ways. One is by slowing down, by let's say adding manual reviews and so on. In the meantime, your competitors are lapping you. And on the other hand, you might structure your app such that every piece is independent. And then it's really easy to just reason about the file that's in front of you, because you might say, I can reason about one file at once. I can tell that this file is not broken, therefore pushing to production will not break when I push this change. And that's great, but at least for web development and for app development, it comes at a cost. If you imagine a website where every component fetched its own data, you're going to hit the backend with a lot more requests for redundant data than you otherwise would. You're going to show chaotic loading states, and if you have an outer component and an inner component, the outer component will complete its network request before the inner component even starts its network request. So you end up showing the data that the user cares about later than you otherwise would. An alternative to that is just sort of handcrafting one query for a given page. And that's great at first, but it's brittle because you come back and it's unclear whether you can ever remove any particular field. And so there's, if you try to remove a field because you think it's unused, you risk bringing down production. And the upside is that maybe your app doesn't get 0.001% slower. And like, I would look at that trade off and think, hey, it's a Friday. I want to go out and grab drinks. I'm not going to remove this field. And over time, your app gets slower and slower, and there's a whole bunch of fields that nobody knows why they're there, but everyone's afraid to remove them. Okay, so that's where I had gotten to. I hope you forgive the 2 minutes of redundancy there. Um, Now, I hear what you're saying. GraphQL solves this problem, and you're 100% correct. GraphQL does solve this problem, and that is, I try to take the best things of GraphQL and improve upon them because GraphQL is awesome. GraphQL gives us the ability to have components that declare their own data, but bubble up to a single query for the entire page that fetches just the fields you need, and then sort of when you change one of these dependencies, the query automatically changes. And there's no sort of manual work of maintaining this query or there's no hand maintenance of the query. Okay, so slight change. A designer gives you this mockup. It's quite beautiful. We're web engineers. We look at this, we think this is a bunch of components. There's a avatar component, there's some user info, there's something to do with the reviews, and so on and so forth. And what's really nice about GraphQL is that this also lends itself pretty well to writing a query for the given page. So if we're just focused on the avatar here, you might write the query like this. You might select the current user. Off the current user, you'd select the current avatar. And off of that, you'd select the avatar URL. Actually, I mean, that field really should be URL because it's an image, not an avatar. Okay, whatever. You select the avatar URL. But we know GraphQL best practices. So we replace the avatar URL field with a fragment because it's going to be rendered by the avatar component. So I look at this, I'm thinking, that fragment, avatar component underscore avatar, it's only ever going to be read by one function, right? In fact, if you look at a properly designed GraphQL app, each fragment will only ever be read out by a single function. So, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty lazy. I mean, I'm not too lazy to spend a year building a framework, but I'm lazy. And I'm too lazy to decide upon an arbitrary fragment name. I mean, the name that we give the fragment has no effect on the final output. It's a completely arbitrary decision, and we have to use the same one where we spread it and where we used it. I'm too lazy to come up with a prop name to determine how to pass down the fragment reference to the child. Honestly, I'm too lazy to read the fragment in the child component because if you get the fragment reference, there's nothing else you can do except for reading that fragment. And honestly, I don't know about you, but I'm too lazy to spread the fragment and also import the JavaScript for that child component. Because if we're doing one but not the other, our app is necessarily broken. And speaking of which, why do we even have the opportunity to pass that fragment reference to any other component besides the avatar component? If we're doing that, our app is necessarily broken. So these 5 things we can do, like if we've done GraphQL a bunch, they're second nature to us. They're not that bad, but it's a bunch of boilerplate that is an opportunity for you to break your app. And also, if you're new to GraphQL, if you're new to Relay, whatever, it's a lot to think about, and it makes it harder to explain things to other people. Okay, so what I actually want to do for the child component is I want to write a function that's passed an avatar. Okay. Conveniently, we have a UI framework. It's very popular. It's called React. And that part is solved, right? Like there's just some function called myAvatar. It takes data. Data is an avatar, and we do React stuff with it. We render a div. That's pretty cool. Okay. So now we're about to jump to Isograph. So what you're about to see is actual Isograph code, or actual functioning Isograph code. And I'm going to go ahead and say that this works. What we're doing here is we're declaring a field named avatar component on the avatar type. Avatar is a type in your GraphQL schema, which selects the avatar URL. And we go ahead and pass that to this myAvatar function, which is the component that was on the previous page. And this just works. Okay, so that's kind of nice. Now, to access this result, I would really want to just select a field. I don't want to go through the whole rigmarole of fragment spreads and fragment references and all that. So instead of this query that we had from the previous page, I would like this, where we replace the fragment spread with the avatar component directly. And yeah, this works. So here's some more Isograph code. And here we're declaring a field named current user detail page on the query type, which selects the current user and the current avatar, and on there selects the avatar component. And then again, it passes the fields that it read to some sort of arbitrary function that takes a data prop, where the type of that data is, an object with current user. And so what would we actually do in this, sort of this arbitrary function? Well, avatar component, that's a component, right? So let's just go ahead and render it. So this also works. You can just select the components you need that you defined in a previous step, and Isograph will pass them to you, to the other fields. And what's nice about this, there's two things that aren't clear from this slide but are really nice, is one, that data prop, it's fully statically typed. So if you were to hover over it, you'd see that there's, a current user object and a current avatar on that and so on. And secondly, this avatar component, it didn't actually get any data passed to it. It just happens to know that I am the avatar component that is on this specific avatar, so read data from that specific avatar object in our store. So I think that that's kind of a nice user experience. Okay, but these fields, they're not really doing anything on their own. We still need to somehow make a network request to the backend for all of the data and render these child components. So the way we do that is by defining what in Isograph terms is called an entry point, but it's something like a root component, and passing it to this useLazyReference function. So wherever this is rendered, when it's initially rendered, we'll make a network request for all the data that's available on query.userdetailPage. All the data that's needed to fulfill query.userdetailPage and all of its subcomponents. And when we render this, it will initially suspend, and then it will, when the network request comes back, it will unsuspend, and all of the components, all the fields that we defined, will be called with exactly the data that they selected without any other fields. So that's kind of cool. Let's also go into what's happening here. One is that Isograph has a compiler. So the compiler is watching your code changes. So when it encounters this ISO and then backtick entry point thing, it generates a GraphQL query for exactly the fields that are needed by current user detail page. And when it encounters this, the other type of Isograph literal where we start with field, it generates the data structure that's needed to read out just the data for that object. So in that sense, it's very similar to Relay. Okay, so the point of all of this is that developers define components in the data they need, and Isograph takes care of the rest. Throughout this, a goal is that you do as little as possible. You focus on just one function at a time, and Isograph does all of sort of the plumbing and all that work to just make it all happen. You connect your regular React app to Isograph at the root, and then from then on, it's Isograph components all the way down before we bottom out at server fields, which is to say fields that are in your GraphQL schema. Okay, so let's talk advantages of this approach. This approach meaning you define a field, which is the result of calling some function with some fragment data and exposing that in your GraphQL schema. Well, one is that there's no boilerplate. If you think about it, in a properly designed GraphQL app, you already have data masking, which is to say a single function is the only one that's going to look at some GraphQL data, but you have it with a whole bunch of boilerplate. We get that same advantage here, but it's just nicer. And like I said earlier, boilerplate is an opportunity to break your app. You don't want opportunities to break your app, and it certainly makes code review easier. Okay, secondly, discoverability. This isn't a feature in Isograph right now, but you can imagine a world in which we generate some sort of schema extension files, and now you open up graphical and you go to the user object, and you see, hey, in addition to name, first name, last name, whatever, email, you also have this field called user profile or user checkout options or whatever. And that's nice because think about your avatar component. How many versions of that exist in your code base right now? Is it 4? Is it 10? If it's more than 1, I think it's too many. And the only way to get it to be 1 is if you have some sort of discoverability for components. And this is a way to do that. Okay. Next, this is a bit more space-brained here, is that data has a spatial location. So no other framework can tell you that you should not, you can defer the data for the footer that the footer uses because the footer is never on screen during initial paint. That's because in any other framework or in any other situation, like the fact that the footer uses the footer's data is super coincidental. There's no like compile time knowledge that those two go together. But in Isograph, every component is associated with its data, so it's going to be the only framework where it makes sense to say things like, hey, you should defer the data for the footer because we know from analytics that the footer is never initially rendered. And secondly, if we're going to defer the footer's data, it also makes sense to defer the JavaScript for the footer. I mean, that's like a best practice in general, but nobody sort of makes that the default. You have to do that through 2 separate steps. And as we discussed, I'm lazy. I don't like to do that. So yeah, so data as a spatial location, that gives us a bunch of advantages. Next, if we preload some of these Isograph component fields, you basically get entry points. So entry points are a relay concept that is the data plus the JavaScript for a given screen that's loaded imperatively. That's kind of what these are if they were preloaded. And if we calculate these on the server, well, it kind of sounds like what we're just doing is React server components, right? And if we calculate these on the server, but we don't actually send down the JavaScript, we just send down the results, well, now we're either doing server rendering of components or we're just doing, we've just rediscovered GraphQL resolvers. So that's cool. So I stand behind the statement that for GraphQL on the front end, client fields are GraphQL's missing primitive. I think that this concept, which I'll admit is, I don't have a good name for it, I'm calling it client fields or Isograph components, it ties together a bunch of different disparate concepts that were previously disparate but are really the same thing. It's some function from fragment data to some arbitrary value, and it looks like a field. And honestly, like I think as long as it's tying a bunch of different concepts together and it lets us think about things in a sort of a new way, I think it's a pretty good abstraction, and we should hold on to that. Okay. Carl mentioned this earlier, but a big announcement is that as of a few hours ago, I've officially launched Isograph version 0.10, so an alpha version, not version 1, but that's okay because it is here and it is ready to be used. It's super feature incomplete. There's a lot more to it, and like the APIs are definitely going to change in a lot of key ways, but like it gives you the developer experience that I want to provide, at least for some of the main flows. And honestly, like I really hope that you try it out. And in particular, I want everyone in this on this call to do one specific thing. I want you to go to that URL that's on the bottom of the screen, which is isograph.dev/tweet. And you'll see here this particular tweet. And I want you to click on it, retweet it, follow Isograph. Because we need to spread the word. I think this is a huge improvement in terms of developer experience over other ways to build data-driven apps, and like it would just be really awesome if more people learned about it. And also, if you want to get involved, like now is a great time because there's still sort of foundational work to be doing on this, and I think it's a pretty good framework that's pushing the boundaries of what's possible with web development right now. Anyway, that's sort of my prepared talk right now. There's a lot more in Isograph. We can go whatever direction you want to take it, Carl.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, thanks so much. Super cool. Yeah, so I have played briefly with Relay over the years. I'll be honest, in my own personal projects, I never got over the initial wall of setup.
Hmm.
So I'm familiar with the promises of Relay more than I am experienced with them in practice. But a lot of what you're saying reminds me a lot of the what I've heard of the benefits of Relay. So, could what's sort of like the core differentiator? Like, what's the difference between components using Relay defining their own data and the benefit that Isograph gives?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in many ways a hopefully an easier to use version of Relay, and especially if you understand Relay, like that's I think the best one sentence explanation of what's going on here.
Okay.
So that being said, like there are several things that where I differ from how Relay behaves. None of which I think are like impossible to bring into Relay. So I hope some of these are proven out, I guess, and end up in Relay because Relay has a way bigger audience of users than Isograph does. But like some of the key things that are different are one, um, obviously less boilerplate. You don't need to pass down fragment references and all this kind of stuff. Secondly, one thing that's really difficult with Relay is reusing fragment spreads or reusing fragments. You might imagine a world in which you have a stitched together schema where you have like um, a stripe schema, right, as part of your schema, And so in Relay, it doesn't really make sense to think like, oh, I might build some reusable component that's a stripe checkout button, but like that's on the Isograph roadmap. So not limiting, and the reason for that is that specifically the component and the fragment that it depends on are one unit in Isograph, and it's like it just makes less sense to enable that in Relay, because sure you might be able to import some sort of fragment spread from some other thing, but it's kind of a lot. Um,
Right.
okay, the biggest I think developer experience win in Isograph, and that's available right now, is I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Is how mutations are done. So if we go back here, um, so basically mutations are a source of stress in Relay, which is to say you need to know what fields to refetch on a mutation. And that sort of is global knowledge. And so like if somebody adds a component and it doesn't, and you don't add the fields back to some sort of mutation that mutates the object, you end up with like a view where some fields have been refetched but others haven't, and it's all sorts of problems. Um, some people don't know that they have this problem, but they do. So, um, okay, so like if you look at this this Isograph component here, it's got this set best friend field on there. This is actually defined on the mutation. Actually, why don't I just show it in the actual code base? Pet updater here. So we have this set pet best friend field here, and this is defined on the schema. So if we go to, let's say pet/schema, we have set pet best friend. It's not actually defined on the pet, but like this is a field on pet. And on the other hand, we have this schema extension here that says, hey, this set pet best friend, let's expose it magically on pet. So what Isograph does is say like, hey, there's a mutation that primarily returns a pet. Let's actually expose it on the pet so we can update the pet's best friend. And now this is just a function that you call. And what it does is call that mutation for you. Okay, that's cool. It also passes the ID correctly. We've said that the pet's ID turns into the set pet best friend ID parameter here. But like with any other mutation, you need to specify what fields to refetch. Okay, so we have to do something like this, and we need to refetch potential best friends. Somebody else might be selecting best friend, so we probably should do that. And what fields are we selecting on the best friend? Maybe name, email. No, we don't need to do any of that. So in Isograph, the fields that are selected as part of the set pet best friend, hard to pronounce,
A little bit.
mutation. I'm really making this difficult for myself, right? Um, it's going to be, let's see, it's going to be called one of these refetch guys. I actually don't know which one it is. Yeah, pet best set pet best friend. Yeah, it's kind of ugly lead named, but whatever. Um, so this is all generated code here. This is going to refetch. This is going to call that mutation set pet best friend with the fields that you passed in plus an ID that's auto piped in and all the fields that were selected on that pet in the generated query or in the merged query. So which is to say, like if on potential new best friends we stop selecting name, here we have name, we save it. I'm actually running the compiler. Let me run the compiler. I think it's watch pet demo. Yeah, probably. Cool. Now, am I watching it?
Live demos, am I right?
Oh, yeah, no, here. Oh, sorry. We were looking at the wrong field. Okay, so now it's gone. So now name is not here on this potential new best friends. But if we add it back, then name starts to show up. So basically, the fields that you were refetching are automatically the correct ones, and you don't need to worry that somebody else added a component elsewhere. So you'll also notice that the fields that we're refetching here is like a bunch of other stuff, name, favorite phrase, blah, blah, blah. And that's not part of this component. So it's like actually all the stuff that's in the merged query. So that's one example of how Isograph like provides a better developer experience. And we need to customize this because we're clearly overfetching in this mutation. You set the pet best friend, the pet's tagline does not change as a result of that. So I need to add some customizability to that. That's like on the roadmap. Not quite there yet. Yeah, I think that's like that kind of gives a summary or gives a sense of how I differ from Relay or how this differs from Relay.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there's more of a concept of components than what Relay has. I guess I'm just trying to boil it down to like a single sentence, but maybe that's unfair.
Yes, there are. I mean, components are somewhat of a first class thing. Like, really, you should think of these as if we take out this at component, this is now the simple model is as follows. Like now it's just a function of data, right? And then this is something or other. And if we look at the props of data, this is going to say, oh, I mean, pet updater param. So unfortunately, it doesn't actually tell me what it is. But if we do data dot, potential new best friend, like this is what you should really think about is the model, right? We have a function from some fragment data, and whatever the result of this function is the type of this field on the top, wherever pet updater is used.
I
So
see. Interesting. Okay.
yeah,
So you can the at component after the field designator tells the compiler to add a lot of
yes,
add that boilerplate that Relay would ask you to write on your own.
it adds a lot of boilerplate. Yes, it does a lot of
Okay.
boilerplate for you. And in
Okay.
particular, if we look at component cache, what it actually does is like it ends up calling this function. Like there's some sort of global cache of components, and the component that you get is this guy, which is to say the component actually reads the data, and this will suspend if the data is missing. So at component is not like this because it doesn't immediately execute. It
I
doesn't
see.
immediately execute or read the fragment. It waits till the next render to read the fragment, and that's nice because you can use suspense boundaries and eventually error boundaries. Um,
Cool.
yeah,
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So
I hope that answered your question. Sorry, I know that was just we went deep there.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Right. Right. She's kind of figuring out in real
Yeah.
time. But okay. Okay. So this the ISO, function wherein you have a query defined, that will work for just loading data. But then you add this at component modifier, and it becomes aware of React in a way that it wasn't before. It
Exactly.
is aware of suspense and loading states. Okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I want Isograph to be independent of React. And so there's probably going to be some sort of like compiler that's lower level, and then there's like a Isograph version, I mean a React version of it that sort of teaches the compiler about act component. But like it's somewhat of a surface level change in that it just like it's basically, yeah, I mean it's kind of a surface level change. So hopefully the base compiler still does 90% of the work, and then like the thing on top just teaches it a few new tricks. And that's going to be nice because something similar should happen for Svelte and Vue and so on and so forth.
Sure. Sure, right. All of these different, non-React libraries have their own sort of concepts
Mm-hmm.
for data fetching and all that. Okay, very interesting. Um, Something that, if I could take us on a turn, you mentioned data-driven apps as sort of the, what Isograph is enabling. Could you talk a little bit about like what's an example of a data-driven app, or where's the line between data-driven or just non-data-driven?
Um, Not sure the where the line is specifically. I think that
Sure.
most of the time we are building most of the complexity comes from fetching data in an app. Like
Yeah.
when I showed you the mock-up of the uh, user detail page or whatever. Like it's really easy to break that up into components and do that statically, or like design some static version of that. And then it just becomes incredibly difficult as soon as the data is changing or we have to fetch data and so on and so forth. So I think that the sweet spot that Isograph is going to target is any situation where um, that is a burden. So,
Sure.
um, and in particular,
Sure.
like I
Okay.
think that like the more that the framework knows about the state of your app, ultimately the better. So GraphQL is very limited in what it can do with variables. Like you can't have a situation where like include if this one variable equals, if the current page equals home page, include the home page fields, right? Um, I mean, you can do that with the type name, right? But like not with variables. And so that's the kind of stuff that needs to go into this isograph language. Like this looks like GraphQL, but obviously, field, this part isn't. Um, and so eventually, in the long term, the isograph language will become more powerful and you can express more and more of what you want, what data you want in sort of the isograph language. And then isograph becomes this global controller of all of your of anything that affects what fields you end up fetching. And that way you can do a lot of static analysis and prefetching and stuff like that automatically without ending up with waterfalls, or at least ideally.
Sure. Right. Right. I mean, precisely the balance between precisely controlling loading states and allowing it to be automated is, yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs in control versus complexity, I think there.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, yeah, okay, so that makes sense. So GraphQL does the querying and the fetching, and the value Isograph is providing here is in being more aware of what the framework is doing with that data and the sequence and how it loads. Is that a fair
Yeah, that's
description?
fair. Yeah, that's fair. In the long term, I don't
Okay.
want it to be limited to GraphQL. GraphQL right now is a compilation target. It's the best one for what I want, which is that because it has, fragments and composability and stuff like that. But like, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to generate SQL, some sort of like complicated SQL query that we know how to work with. So in the long term, not just GraphQL, but yes, GraphQL is a compilation target that does exactly that, what you just said.
I see. Okay, interesting. Okay, so that I saw that in your presentation, or in the talk you gave in September. You talked about React apps with GraphQL, and a later slide you mentioned just apps with data. So I see where you're coming from with that. Right now it's gluing those are the two ends that you're gluing together, but your goal is to provide an abstraction that
Exactly.
works for any library, any form of data. Okay, where GraphQL is a current query language for selecting data over the network, but obviously there are a lot of different types of ways to do that. Okay, okay, that's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, like one of the things that I think is would be super compelling is like you can imagine like this part is what executes on the server, and this part is what executes potentially on the client. But like we can just think of it as executing on the client, and you can imagine like here what we want is something like uh, fs.read file, right? Like my blog post, right? And then just
Sure.
return that. Something like this, where this is exactly the code that executes on the server, and we still get. I mean, it sort of subsumes what I think that React Server components are trying to achieve. Except you
Right.
also get something like, um, maybe you also say something like, and I need this other component. So now instead of like React Server components have this problem where um, you end up with server side waterfalls because you render the outer component, it goes to the database, then you render some child component, and it also needs to go to the database. And so there's no like
Right.
statically discoverable way of saying that like, hey, I need all three components, not just one. So I think this might enable something like the arbitrariness of React Server components, like the arbitrary behavior that they can do on the server, while also allowing static discovery of dependencies. But again, maybe not. We'll see.
Sure. Sure, right. I mean, going back to sort of talking about code executing on the server, I've worked on a couple of projects that did server-side rendered React, and that has always been the hardest challenge of doing it is you get the waterfalls and either the data isn't ready immediately, as you're trying to render, you end up needing this like parallel data structure wherein you describe what data you want to load so that you can load it in order to render it on the server. I have yet to work on a project that solved that well, so it's definitely interesting to see to see this approach. I know that my understanding is that was the value proposition of Relay, it, and yeah, that was so challenging to set up that I never got it working for myself. Never worked on a large enough team where, or never worked on a project where the team size was large enough and the application was large enough to where we got over that initial hump of setup. So okay, so very cool. So you're working on the goal here being to solve that problem in a little bit more accessible way.
Yes. Yeah. So fingers
Cool.
crossed, hold my feet to the fire. If it's tough to adopt Isograph, like let me know. I want it to be easier.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. And so you mentioned React server components. So where does Isograph fit in with React server components? Does it work right? d- Does it work with it right now? Is that on the roadmap?
Doesn't work with
I
it right now. This is all theoretical.
Sure.
I mean,
Okay.
the long roadmap, long backlog. Like, if
Yeah.
we take a look at
I mean,
the,
the list of things that work with React server components right now is extremely short. So
yeah,
I would have been very surprised and impressed.
yeah, like this is we got quite a backlog. So eventually, one of these will, eventually we'll get to it. But the way I imagine, the way I think that this compares to server components are one, there's that static discoverability on the server, so you can prevent server waterfalls. And server waterfalls might not be a problem in some specific cases. Like if you imagine, if you have a very similar setup to what Meta has, which is that if you fetch one item from a database, you fetch all the rows, I mean, all the columns on that row. If you, and then keep it in memory, like if you have a parent component that that selects the user and some child components that also select the user, you're not actually doing a server waterfall, even though it looks like you might. And even if you end up selecting different fields. So there's certainly situations where the server waterfall isn't a problem. And other times, like if the database, if the database is just so fast that it doesn't matter, like it might not matter. So one, I think that in other situations where that does matter, like let's say your database is in a different data center, or you're hitting the Stripe API in your server component sort of redundantly, and it doesn't, really behave exactly like you want it to, in a way that's optimized for server components. Like Isograph in this kind of a situation, or for that matter, uh, Relay, if it did this kind of stuff on the server, would be better suited from a performance perspective. But sort of taking a step back also, I think that server components, from what I understand, it's very, very focused on sending down UI components to the front end, pre-calculating and sending down UI components. But like that shouldn't be the only thing that we care about pre-calculating. You might imagine a world in which, well, you really should be thinking about sending down this tree or this like DAG to the front end, where let's say the full name renderer, it depends on the full name, which depends on the first and last name, right? And right now with React Server components, you can only send down the rendered HTML output for the full name renderer, right? But like if there's a bunch of components that depend on the full name, it might be more efficient to just send down the full name and say like, hey, all you dependencies, like you know about this particular object, the full name. And alternatively, if that full name is mutable on a given, or like we might change the first name on a given page, you don't actually just want to send down the rendered output of the full name field. You want to send down its dependencies and sort of calculate it on the front end. Maybe pre-calculate it, but also send down the data dependencies. So I sort of think of React Server components as doing one specific aspect of what in the long term will be possible with Isograph, which is React Server components lets you send down the very first layer of this DAG, but like there's this big set of roots underneath, and at any of those might be reasonable targets for pre-calculation. And yeah,
Okay.
that should all be sort of transparent to the user. Like you should always be able to write like the same function. Like the full name function should always be first name plus space plus last name. And like if it executes on the server, like you don't write the component any different. You don't write that field any differently. You just maybe select it differently at like the call site, or some sort of bundler understands that like, hey, this field is mutable on this page, so like we can't send down just the just the server calculated version.
Right. Okay, interesting.
Again, far in the future.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, talking about the future. So, what's top of mind for you? What are you working on right now? You just shipped your O.1. What's going in the next release?
Yes. Next release includes Windows support. We just got a PR adding Windows support, and like unfortunately,
Nice.
it just missed the cut, but it would have been so exciting to bring it in. And what's cool about this is that this is actually the first PR where I didn't really ask for this feature explicitly of this person, so I'm really excited that like it's actual community contribution. Okay, but I think in the short to medium term, like the big features that I want are a lot of like feature parity with Relay. So right now, pretty good at fetching data lazily, like during render. There's no integration with the router. There's no prefetching. All this stuff should be fairly easy to add. Granular re-rendering is not a thing that Isograph has. It has the potential to do it. I just haven't implemented it. Garbage collection, all the sort of stuff that would actually make this a usable, a reasonable choice for an app with, with performance in mind. And then, there's a bunch of other features that are just like not they're still missing. Like if a mutation doesn't match, it doesn't work. Like we previously described the set pet best friend mutation. Can't really use it right now. That's okay.
Mm,
I'll figure out a way to expose it, and allow that. And subscriptions also not allowed, or not supported. So feature parity with Relay, and then I think the other big thing that I care about is discoverability. So that can be in two different buckets. One is like exporting something that graphical can understand. That should be fairly easy. And then there's this sort of much larger bucket, which is a VS Code extension.
cool. And that would be like language server
Yes,
integration kind of
exactly.
thing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So,
Autocomplete. Very valuable.
mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really curious. We've got about 10 minutes left in the hour. We do want to open up to questions, but I'm very curious about the discoverability aspect of this. So you talked about discovering components as a developer. Like, how does Isograph help with that? What's the vision there?
So the vision here is one, all the fields that you're defining, like the pet updater, now that's a field on pet. So anywhere where you're looking at all the fields on pet, like name, species, whatever, you also are shown pet updater. And then there's some sort of like maybe the description that you provide or some auto-generated description that's like, this is a component defined in this project. But that's like step one. What I really want to enable is like a click and drag style interface where you are a business analyst. You do not understand, you have enough, you can write some JSX, but you don't really know what's going on. I want you to be able to pull open a sidebar that says like, hey, I'm on a current user. Like we're doing a user page, right? And then you see a bunch of components like user avatar. Is the user behind on their payments? Like, what are the recent payments? You click and drag those onto a page, and it just works. So, like, I'm sort of imagining something like Retool, where everything is automatically connected to data, and because Isograph does all like the plumbing for you, like it kind of just works. That's ultimately like what I want to enable.
Interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
you say like open a sidebar, drag and drop interface. So is this like would that be like a SaaS like retool, or is this going to be like a developer tool in VS Code?
Probably a SaaS. Yeah.
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 Okay, interesting. So
I
this
don't want
would
to build
be
it per se, but like that's what I wanted somebody to be able to build with
would
Isograph.
like to enable at the technology level
Yes.
someone to make a drag and drop tool where non-technical people can interact with an application to maybe make their own application. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Explore
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think
Okay.
what's
Make their own UIs for exploring their data. Cool.
yes. And I think what's going to be nice is also like if you can write packages that expose isograph fields, right? Components. So like Stripe might release their own Stripe components package, and your API is consistent with the Stripe API, with Stripe GraphQL API, or it's like stitched together or something. And you just say like, hey, I'm on a Stripe thing, like, and also I've Yarn installed Stripe components, and now you suddenly see like checkout button, and you suddenly see like whatever else Stripe would provide.
Sure. Very cool. Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah. And that shouldn't be like that hard because like you imagine a lot of stuff is just off of an ID. Like if you have a tweet ID, like that's a string, you don't really need to have like all of Twitter's GraphQL API. Like instead the compiler should be smart enough, and it will be eventually, to just say like, hey, if you're going from an ID and you're actually selecting the tweet text, like under the hood, that's a waterfall. And like some people are okay with that. So like you should be able to say like, hey, given this tweet ID, like let me just like immediately, I mean, let me just click and drag like this view right here that you're looking at, and it should just work. So I guess like the schema stitching part is overselling what I think would be required to make this work.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Cool. Uh, let's open it up for questions now.
Cool.
Anyone in the audience, feel free to raise your hand and we can bring you up to speak. But that's a really interesting vision for a, I don't know, more interactive way of, I don't know, interacting with your data, interacting with external services. So you mentioned Retool. Is there something, where do you think that they are not going far enough? I am
I
loosely
don't know
familiar
anything
with
about
Retool.
Retool. I've used them in the past. I thought they were great.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
I think that
Yeah.
the automatic, I don't know if they do the automatic connecting of data sources to like some sort of like parent query, but like I would imagine that if you're doing an internal tool with Retool, like you don't necessarily care about waterfalls because it's an internal tool and
Right.
that's what they're optimizing for. So I imagine that like what this gives you is something more, um, something more performant out of the box. And that just might not matter for a lot of situations, but it might matter in others. So,
For sure.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I think that one thing, I mean, it's not specific to Retool, right? But like another thing that like Isograph would enable that isn't necessarily well handled by GraphQL right now is I want to add the ability to automatically refetch if any data is missing. So right now with GraphQL, with relationship changes, you can't guarantee that any field is necessarily not null, right? Or is actually present. So you might imagine
mm,
you've selected the best friend's name, and then you modify the best friend, and in the mutation, the new best friend, you don't select their name, right? So now you're rendering the best friend's name and it's missing. And like that's fine, honestly, for like a social media company. If you don't know the author of a post, like who cares? Written by unknown.
sure.
Um, and that's not fine if you're trying to use GraphQL for a banking app where you need to show the current amount of money in your account or the latest price of some security or whatever. And on the one hand, if every single time some data was missing on a very large social media website, we made another request to the back end, like the economics would not work out. But if you're paying $100 a month to, $22,000 a month for the Bloomberg terminal, 20 per year for the Bloomberg terminal, um, making a bunch of extra requests for that data, like it's a rounding error compared to the amount you're paying for this app. So like that's another situation where I think like the where Isograph can go in the long term will be very helpful.
Oh, okay. Very neat. Well, folks, we are available for questions if you have anything. Or let me know if you can't raise your hand. Haven't seen any come in, but yeah. So if this caught anyone's fancy and it got their brain whirring in interesting directions, how could they get involved? What kind of help are you hoping for, looking for?
Yeah. Um, so there's a Discord. It's linked to on isograph.dev, and I have a there's just a bunch of issues on the GitHub repo that I think are good first issues. But like more to the point, like if you want to help out, like I'll find something that fits your like what your preferences are. Like I really want this to be not just me pushing it forward. We have another guy helping out, Edmondo. He's my good friend. Like, but it just can't be just the two of us. Um, and I think that's I mean, reach out and we'll figure something out. Like I want to make it a good experience for you to contribute. So,
For sure. All right. Reach out where? Discord, Twitter?
Discord or Twitter. Yeah, either of those is fine.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. We have a hand raised. Uh,
Well, I lost him. I heard. I didn't hear anything. So,
uh, all right.
okay.
Should be up. You are muted right now. Oh,
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the philosophy again. It's against storybook promotions, component-driven development. Is it because we are lazy? Thank you.
Um. Sorry. So, could you clarify your question? Could you rephrase it?
I mean, this package is developed because are we lazy? We are lazy
Uh,
because bottom to up approach seems more logical, isn't it?
sorry. Could you say that. I mean, I. What are you asking? Um, how what do you so is the approach is the question like is Isograph like does the reason for its existence is because we are developers are lazy and too lazy to do the right thing? Is that
Yes, yes, that's the question.
yeah, I think so. I think that honestly like we could theoretically be very careful in very large apps, but like inevitably an app gets large enough that you can't that like a lack of laziness isn't the cure all. And so I think it's okay to be lazy. I think honestly, like I want you to not have to worry. I want you to be able to make changes to one file and not follow all the changes in every single other file, because like that's impossible. That's velocity slows to a crawl. And so I think that to the extent that you can just focus on one file at a time is like ideal. So
Right, right. Enable laziness through reducing the amount of work required to make any individual change, or to ensure that a given change won't break things, I guess. Does that sound right?
yeah, I think so. Um,
Cool.
won't break things accidentally. Like you should at least be aware if something is going to happen without like
Right. If you're
writing
going
a
to
bunch
break
of
them, you should
manual
be on
unit
purpose.
tests. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Um,
You had a question come in on chat. What prompted you to develop this library? Was it because of your experiences at Pinterest?
no, I actually started working on this before joining Pinterest. I joined there in September, and I'd been working on this like at least for several months before that. I think that what prompted this is that I would like to see these changes. And I think GraphQL has a lot of potential, and I don't think existing libraries are really achieving that potential in terms of developer experience. And yeah, I just like to build things, so I figured why not? Yeah, let me
For sure.
devote my life to this moonshot idea. So
Heck yeah. Yeah, have definitely, I don't know, GraphQL has been echoing around as, or the potential of GraphQL has been reverberating off the ecosystem for most of my career, and it just feels like we've never quite gotten there. So it's cool to see a new take on what that potential could be delivered as. So yeah, excited to see what Isograph comes, what comes of it over the next 6 months, next year. Very cool. Sounds
yeah,
like you're in it for the long haul.
I think so. So I really do believe in the idea. Like I think it's honestly going to be like, I mean, right now with the watch mode and with the fact that you don't have to provide any types on your own, like that's actually a super cool thing that Edmondo worked on. Like if you look at this, let me just quickly. This is a generated file right here. We have this. If the type matches, if the call to ISO matches entry point query, has this string in it essentially, we know statically that it is given this type, or that it has this type, which is the entry point type. And so like, if on the other hand we say field pull request comment list, like we know that it is this specific thing, and that's where we get the types coming in automatically. Like I think that there's a lot of things that are like a lot of stuff that has landed that makes this really, really. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. I'm not sharing my screen here. I'm like clicking around like as if anybody can see. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I think this is actually one of the coolest parts of the of the of Isograph right now. So this file right here, iso.ts, is generated, and this is where the types for that ISO literal, or that ISO function that you saw in the slides comes from. So basically, if the type that you pass in has the string field pull request.comment list, then we know that the type of ISO is something that takes this parameter right here. And so this is actually where the type of that data field comes from. And so like if you end up changing the type that the pull request comment list field takes, like this gets regenerated. And so several steps later, in your VS Code editor, you now see that like data.comments.edges.node has a name field or whatever. So
Very cool.
yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Those are some complex looking types. Doing string and white space matching within the type layer is pretty clever. That's pretty neat.
Not gonna lie, it was hard to reason about at first, but it works. It works. I'm not gonna touch it. So yeah.
Reminds me, a couple of years ago, I saw Jamie. Jamie Kyle did a JSON parser in TypeScript. This is not quite so extreme as that, but directionally similar. It sounds like. But
Yeah,
just
yeah. I mean, some people are doing some crazy stuff. This was just a matter of Googling and copy and pasting until I figured out something that worked. And can I explain it to you? Not really.
for sure. All right. Well, I guess we can end it there. Robert, thank you so much for coming out. Isograph sounds super cool. Excited to see what you come out with.
Sweet. All right. Thank you all for attending. Take a look at that isograph.dev/tweet and like and retweet. Smash that subscribe button.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and hop in that Discord too. Cool. All
All
right.
right,
Thanks so
y'all.
much.
Thank you.
See you later.